Today's 60-minute webinar will be a moderated discussion regarding the support of diversity, equity, and inclusion in historic neighborhoods, particularly when it comes to how we address the issue of seismically retrofitting our most vulnerable historic buildings. In Seattle, like many cities in our country, historic neighborhoods tend to have a larger than average representation of women and minority-owned businesses, small businesses, underrepresented community residents, and serve underrepresented communities. And with that in mind, there's also potential to have a disproportionate amount of gentrification, displacement, and public safety impacts on minority communities when it comes to seismically vulnerable buildings. Simply put, the cost of doing nothing disproportionately affects underrepresented communities, and the cost of doing something has the potential to displace underrepresented communities as well. We must strike a balance for maintaining and preserving historic neighborhoods while ensuring that communities can remain equitable, diverse, and intact. Our moderator today is Manish, Chalana, and our esteemed panelists include Eugenia Wu, Michael Winkler-Chin, and Karen True, who will be introduced shortly by our moderator. Manish is an associate professor in the Urban Design and Planning program at the University of Washington. He is the director of the Historic Preservation Graduate Certificate Program and also co-director of the Center for Preservation and Adaptive Reuse. Dr. Chalana is also associated with the University of Washington's Interdisciplinary Institute for Hazards Mitigation Planning and Research at the University of Washington. His work focuses primarily on historic preservation, particularly its intersections with hazard mitigation, social equity, and resilience. And please join me in welcoming our guest. And I'm going to hand the reins over to our moderator.
Thank you, Nick. And thank you, everybody, for taking the time to be on this panel. I'm truly excited to be moderating this session. As I was sharing with my panelists that I'm returning to the topic of URM after several years, and I want to continue working on this topic this point on. So, as Nick said, the panel focuses on equity and inclusion in the context of URM buildings. As we move forward with the mandatory URM retrofit policy, we need to ensure that it does not disproportionately impact any neighborhoods or populations. So that is really what the goal of this panel is, to discuss these issues that might arise, unintended consequences that might arise when this mandatory URM policy goes into effect. So just to give you a very quick half-a-minute background, which all of you are probably already familiar with, Seattle has drafted a URM retrofit policy. I served on that committee. I think Eugenia served on that committee as well, and several others. And that policy is meant to ensure that people remain safe in an event of a catastrophic event, but also that these vernacular buildings, URM buildings, are also not lost to seismic events. So it's both people and places that the policy is focusing on. The mandatory policy requires a BOLTS Plus as a minimum, standard minimum for retrofit. And the policy has not yet been adopted, as you know. So the programs, including tools and incentives, are still under consideration or being developed. So it's really great to have a panelist who's familiar with this topic. So I'm going to be engaging them in this topic, but let me quickly introduce them, and then I'll hand over the mic to them. So today with us, we have Karen True, who is the Director of Business and Community Development in the Alliance for Pioneer Square. We have Michael Winkler-Chin, who's the Executive Director of Seattle Chinatown ID PDA, Preservation and Development Authority. And we have Eugenia Wu, who's the Director of Preservation Services with Historic Seattle. So I'm going to hand over the mic to you all, but let me just start with one sort of the ice-breaking question. So add to your introduction, because I've just given a very brief introduction for you. So please introduce yourself a little more, and also share with us your views more broadly on historic preservation. So this is just a ice-breaking question. So we'll start with Karen, and then move on to Michael and then Eugenia.
So Pioneer Square, of course, it's known as being a historic district. You know, sometimes I think that I wish we had a PR program for historic preservation, because sometimes it feels like historic preservation, what I hear people say is that they think it's just regulation and really a hassle. And yet it's so fun in Pioneer Square to be able to walk by the sinking ship, which is this horrendous garage, that I can point to that and say, that's what would have happened to our whole neighborhood if it weren't for historic preservation. But it's complicated. What I love about Pioneer Square is it's a place that people love to be, and it's because it's a historic place, and it's a place that people care about. And to me, that's historic preservation too, a place that people are worth fighting for. So that's me.
All right, I'll go next. Hi, Maiko. With the Seattle Chinatown International District Preservation and Development Authority. We are a city chartered entity, and our mission is to preserve, promote, and develop the Chinatown International District as a vibrant community and unique ethnic neighborhood. I've worked in community development since I was a younger person, and I've worked in both the CID and Columbia City. And I'm not a historic preservationist at all, but historic preservation is part of the landscape in the communities that I work in. I feel like my places are extremely special. I know Karen feels that way too, but my places are extremely special. And a defining characteristic are the buildings that are there. And they're the places where things happen. I love walking past a building and saying, my father-in-law grew up in that building. I love walking by and say, oh yeah, Ray Chin, I know Ray. He owned that building. And just the stories of our communities. And that's what makes our place unique, our place different than Ballard, which is also a historic neighborhood, or Lake City or someplace else. But it's a defining character. So not a historic preservationist, but it's important to me and my work. Eugenia, to you.
Great, thank you. Michael and I met many years ago in my previous job at the city. Hi everyone, I'm Eugenia Wu, and I've been with Historic Seattle for 11 years now, and essentially Historic Seattle has sort of three focus areas. I lead our preservation advocacy program. We also have education program and also real estate development. So we own 8 historic properties. We've probably saved over 40, 50 historic places since we were created in 1973. We are also, like SCPTA, we are also a preservation development authority chartered by the city. And we're also have a foundation as a 501c3 nonprofit as well. And so sort of the icebreaker question of what does historic preservation mean to us? To me, it's really kind of boils down to 3 things. It's about community, history, and place. And nothing sort of encapsulates that more than what you see on the screen, which is Washington Hall. And I'll kind of refer back to Washington Hall kind of throughout this session, but it's one of our favorite projects. One of my favorite projects is Historic Seattle. It was built in 1908 as a Danish Brotherhood Lodge, and it's in the central area. And it has hosted many gatherings, community gatherings, social gatherings, political events, music, dance, weddings, parties, theater, everything from the beginning. And when we acquired it, we basically saved the building back in 2009. And our goal was to keep it basically how it was, but fix it up. And so it's not a URM, it's a frame building and clad in brick, but that the seismic work on this building was our biggest sort of high ticket item. So whether it's a URM or not, seismic upgrades are very important and they need to meet code. So, but anyway, just want to say that I've been in preservation for a long time. I used to work for the city of Seattle, and I staffed the International Special Review District and the Columbia City Landmark District. And I've worked in private preservation consulting and artifacts. And so having that public, private, and nonprofit sort of those sectors, all 3 sectors, that experience in preservation has really given me a pretty broad outlook. And I've met some great people, including all the people on this panel, and Nick and Manish through my work. And so just fortunate that I'm in the field that I love, and that I'm here today. Thanks.
Thank you, panelists. This is wonderful. We have multiple experiences in different neighborhoods, and then with Eugenia, we have institutional memory and sort of the overarching frame of preservation practice in the US. So I'm going to throw out another question for you all in no particular order. You may respond to this. So share with us how your work with historic preservation, and I'm broadly defined because I know Maiko doesn't identify as a historic preservationist, so broadly defining it, how does it intersect with URM buildings or policies or in neighborhood context? So just share with us so the audience becomes familiar with that intersection. So no particular order, anyone can go first if you like.
I'll go first.
Okay.
Since I'm not the historic preservationist. So I work in what's broadly defined amorphously as community development, whatever that means, right? That's typically defined as affordable housing, economic development, just a variety of different things that happen very specifically in a neighborhood. And so our stakeholders, the people that we work with and who our mission drives us to work with, are property owners, businesses, residents. And in the Chinatown International District, they all these people function in and around historic properties. And so if I am not mindful of these policies that happen in and around these buildings that impact my community so greatly, I'm going to be really, really devastated when something happens policy-wise that I didn't keep my tabs on. So the stakeholders that I work with are involved in these buildings. We also own, we're similar to Historic Seattle, we own buildings, we own URM buildings, and we use them to live our mission. But you know, when you work in a neighborhood that has a high concentration of unreinforced masonry buildings, a lot of our buildings in the historic core are underutilized due to past public policies around, say, fire code, life safety issues. When you become familiar with the property ownership that happens in some of these buildings, some of our buildings are owned by hundreds of people, and trying to have anybody make a financial decision, an expensive financial decision with hundreds of people, that's impossible. And the quality of our buildings, some of our buildings haven't been touched in 50, 60 years, and you still have people living in them. That is of concern. Our neighborhood tends to be low income, and you know, we have one of the highest poverty rates in the city of Seattle. Our population tends to be older. Our people are way older than the average people. I mean, way older than me. And so, you know, in Chinatown, the joke is like 65, that's not a senior. Senior in Chinatown is like 80, 85, right? Because 65 is nothing. We also have a growing number of children, very young in the neighborhood as well. And so those people are very vulnerable to change as well as earthquakes. So that's kind of it. It's not the focus of my work, but if I don't keep an eye on it, the potential impacts are devastating to my neighborhood. Sorry, I went way long. I'm surprised I didn't get the Manish cut off now.
Oh, you're all right.
Well, maybe I'll jump in next, because again, it's kind of the neighborhood thing. And we too have very similar things and different. We have vulnerable populations. We've got missions. We've got emergency housing in the neighborhood, lots of community service, in addition to residents and businesses. I think a couple of the things that are interesting to me with URM is with building owners. We have lots of building owners who are very nervous about, especially the like family-owned buildings, about you know, will they even be able to afford to make the upgrades when they're mandatory? And so what does that mean for the neighborhood if we lose a lot of local ownership. The other thing that is the whole displacement thing. As buildings are rehabilitated, and which is fabulous, and yet a lot of these small business owners are paying very low rents, and those rents will not be low anymore when the building is completed. So it's tough. So businesses will be displaced, and they are displaced, and that's rough.
So Historic Seattle, because we're citywide, we don't work in one specific neighborhood, but we're very familiar with both Pioneer Square and the CID. So we work all over the city. So on the one hand, we own our own historic buildings. One of them is a URM. It's sort of the poster child for URM, the Cadillac Hotel in Pioneer Square. And I'm poster child in a good way, because
Right.
we didn't own it during the 2001 earthquake when a chunk of it collapsed. That was the previous owner, not us. And then we came in and we saved it and we fixed it up. So otherwise it would have been an empty lot, and you would have had a circa 2000, mid-2000 building infill project in Pioneer Square right now. And so we absolutely love that building. Good Shepherd Center in Wallingford. It's also a URM, and so ever since we learned about sort of the potential mandatory legislation, we had it assessed, structural engineer, we've had an architect do a design for us, and we're raising funds, grant writing and all that, just to figure out how to afford to fund such a massive project. It houses dozens of nonprofits, a school, a senior center, all kinds of people and uses. So it's very important that, so we want to make sure that our tenants are safe and all the users of our buildings are safe. That's the main priority. So that's why we take it so seriously. And then on the other side, in terms of technical assistance and helping our constituents and the public, we get a lot of inquiries from property owners and business owners, and people asking about what is this URM mandate, and what does this mean for my building, and how am I going to pay for it? So it's all these questions that I think all of us on this panel have received, and so those are all really good questions and concerns. And so so we do hear from a lot of people about why is this important, or why do we even need to do it? So I've been working in the URM sort of arena for a while now. I was on the URM policy committee, as Manish mentioned, that the city created. And then also in the 2001 Nisqually earthquake, I was at the city, and I remember going and meeting with owners of the Chinatown ID and looking at the buildings and some of the damage, and trying to help them kind of figure out what to do. I walked around with a translator that the city provided, which was really great. My Cantonese is decent enough, but not quite great. And so that's in certain neighborhoods that becomes even more of a challenge, because you have language barriers. It's for how do you figure out how to do what you need to do when the city tells you you need to do something, and they've red tagged a building or yellow tagged a building. And so yeah, it's the URM thing kind of permeates many of our lives in different ways. And so yeah.
Thank you, panelists. This is a good segue into my next question, because all of you mentioned community, people, tenants, residents, so it's not just about buildings, it's really about people as well. So I want to just, take a broad sort of view, a vantage of the seismic culture in our region. And I'll quickly paraphrase Dagan Homan, what seismic culture really means. They argue that, in the way that humans interact with hazards through centuries or through time, it generates a seismic culture that gets ingrained in the society that could be both beneficial or detrimental in dealing with the seismic events. And it's just not humans, but it's also culture, organizations and institutions as well, which are, staffed by humans. So I want to throw a question to you all about, what in your mind is the seismic culture of our region, and how does that mindset or collective mindset impact cultural resources more generally, but URM specifically? You know, so we'll start with Eugenia. You want to go first, and then we can go around. Eugenia, Maiko, and then Karen.
Sure. And thank you for bringing this. Actually, I wasn't familiar with the term seismic culture, so until we our group talked yesterday, it was something new that I learned, and it just really made me think about what the seismic culture here is, or is there one? What awareness there is, and I think because this region, there's so many people who come here from other places, either places where you're used to earthquakes, like California, like myself, or places where someone's never experienced it before, and so there's a big range. And so, but it seems like generally here, we had the 2001 earthquake, there was the one in the 60s, and then the 49 one. They happen infrequently enough, the bigger ones, that people forget, or they weren't alive then, or whatever. And you see many of these older buildings still standing, and so it's easy to say, well, my 100-plus-year-old brick building is still here. It didn't really sustain any damage. Why do I need to spend the money to upgrade this? I'm not going to get there's no return on investment in this. And I can't charge more rent for this. So, I can't pass it down or whatever. And so the culture is sort of, we know earthquakes are dangerous, essentially, but a lot of wringing of hands, a lot of spending years in policy making, drafting legislation, nothing's getting passed, and then you move on to something else. And then it's the emergency of the day or of a few months, and it gets discussed because it's in the Seattle Times. And the article that I remember coming out was the one that said buildings kill. And when I see stuff like that, it makes my job harder, because then people immediately think, well, then they should be torn down so that they won't kill. So, well, no, that's not the solution to this. And so a lot of misinformation that's still out there. So education is really key to create a seismic culture that's informed, that's not, decisions aren't driven out of hysteria or like fear, but by technology and science, and but also us and about people. And it's we need safer buildings for people. And there's no such thing as earthquake proof. There's earthquake resistance, but there's no earthquake proof.
I build on what Eugenia said. I'd never heard the term seismic culture either, and my blunt assessment is we choose to ignore it, right? It's too much for people to bear financially. It's too devastating for anybody that's in political office to move that agenda forward because it's an unfunded mandate. I was just thinking, and I've mentioned this before, and this is an awful corollary, but we have shooting drills at school. At least my daughter does, being where she goes to school. We don't have earthquake drills. I'm kind of remember earthquake drills from when I was a kid, but we don't do that regularly. For my community, there's a large population from China. We remember the earthquake that hit, I think, Sichuan province, and 30,000 people died like that with buildings falling. But this is America, man. Our buildings are better than that, so they shouldn't happen. And similar to what Eugenia said, oh man, this building's 100 years old, and it's still standing. It's got to be okay, right? So for all those things, I think we would rather just choose to ignore the fact that we will probably have a major earthquake at some point, and it's not the emergency of the day. I'm in my basement. I don't have water stored. I didn't like do these things to my house because there's always something more urgent potentially. And at this point, it's COVID. So with COVID coming on, I don't think we're going to, dare I say, we're not going to have any sort of mandatory earthquake thing coming up for years, because that would be devastating to the recovery of the region. Ooh, I said that, sorry.
Karen?
Well, again, seismic culture is fascinating to me, and I've been thinking about it a bit. Like Eugenia was saying, the hysteria piece has been really interesting because I also remember when that article about buildings that kill came out, and there were employers saying that they had workers who were crying now that they were afraid to come to work in Pioneer Square. And of course, it's died down, but I do wonder if it would be, how great it would be for there to be a more informed seismic culture, that everyone was a little more aware and informed. And, you know, it makes me think, gosh, in Pioneer Square, that is something that the Alliance should be sharing information about with businesses and property owners, just some basics, because it's a scary thing. So.
Thank you. I'm hearing the keywords that come to my mind are denial, not very urgent, right? And like Michael, you said, something else always taking precedent before this. But one could argue that the URM policy is trying to shift that and trying to be a little proactive. But as you say, the time it's taking for it to, go through the channels, it reflects what the culture is as well. So good segue into the next one. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the unintended consequences of the mandatory URM retrofit policy, right? There are many, and some of them have already emerged, but I just want you to focus on not on the solutions yet, but just the unintended consequences of the mandatory URM policy, and how might that policy disproportionately impact certain neighborhoods or certain populations. So from your work in different neighborhoods, and Eugenia, your work for the city. So this time, I think we'll start with Michael. We'll go with you first, and then followed by Karen, and then Eugenia.
So some of the, I think all of the unintended consequences of a mandatory policy, when I talk about them, I think you're all going to know them. So, and we've seen this already happen with some of the properties in the neighborhood, that property owners are probably going to sell. They do not have the resources to take on the work, to understand the work. They understand it's worth millions. And we've had some grants where we've helped people figure it out a little bit as to what the cost is going to be. And they kind of freak out because a lot of our property owners have never had debt. They just don't, they're not a debt culture, right? And so you pay with cash, and then they're like, oh my gosh, okay, fine. Do they have the resources to do with it? If not, they sell. When they sell, new property owner comes in. Now they probably have a mortgage, or they want to get their money back, which then means that rents go up. And if you go through bank financing, you might have earthquake insurance, which is extremely difficult and expensive to get. So that could add. All of that means that there's increased costs to the businesses or to the residents. Not all businesses are the same. A bar may be able to pay more for rent than a non-bar, a tea shop, or something, a coffee shop, or a household goods store, right? It's just because their price points are different, and what they can afford in rent is very, very different. And so you might lose the businesses that are really integral to your neighborhood, or the businesses that really serve a neighborhood. The hair salon, the hair cutter, right? All those. And those people are really part of community, and people in community really need them. So then the nature of your neighborhood really, really changes. And then the rehabilitation work itself could be of such a magnitude that you're going to cause businesses to relocate or shut down, and the challenges of all that, as we've seen through COVID. And that doesn't even talk about the people living upstairs in the building. So we've seen some buildings, some property owners sell their properties, and it caused 60 people to have to move out and find rent somewhere else. They weren't allowed to stay within the community. And in a neighborhood like ours, people really rely on it because they can live well, they can live comfortably in a language that is not English. They can get the food, the services that they need in order to stay connected with each other in a very, very different way without having English. And so that then causes other unintended consequences as well. So the people are really, really impacted, I think. And then you also don't get to know their property owners as well in the same way. I'm not seeing them as I walk down the street. They're not calling me about bizarre things like, hey, can I use your dumpster? And then you're just like, why are you using my dumpster, right? I mean, those kind of very small town conversations that are really intrinsic to our work in the community and what does this mean, and to those relationships that really make our communities important places.
Mhm.
Maiko, everything you said, those are so important in Pioneer Square too. And it's not only, it's the people in the community are losing those businesses when they can't find new homes. But it's heartbreaking when there are businesses who are so committed to the community because they care so deeply. And you know, I've had businesses come to me and say, "Oh my God, I'm losing my space, but I don't want to leave Pioneer Square. You've got to help me find something." And it's tough. You can't just pull that stuff out of your pocket. And so you're right. The people in the community lose, that business loses. And then when you have fewer local property owners, again, you aren't able to call a property owner anymore to say, "Oh my gosh, do you have a space? I need to get somebody in." So just those relationships, it's just devastating to the relationships. I know there are lots of things, but it's big, and it sounds soft and squishy, but it's really big.
It's really big.
Really, really big.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, some of the unintended consequences, and one of the biggest one I see, and I brought this up when I was on the policy committee from day one and throughout the years I was on it, is essentially what happens to your more common everyday buildings, URM buildings, not the landmarks, not the ones in the historic districts. And the city tends to think, big city, capital C, tends to think of landmarks and historic districts. And then, but it's not it should not be a static thing. I mean, there are plenty of buildings out there that are eligible, can be, but it shouldn't just be landmark or not landmark. And that's not how that hierarchy should, not that we have to save everything, that's not what I'm saying, but there are a lot of places like that really add to sort of your neighborhood character, your 1 to 3 story kind of brick vernacular building or commercial building, and they're generally more affordable too. So to many small businesses, they can have their coffee shop there, or their hair salon, or their flower shop, or name your business. And those are the places that are most vulnerable because maybe they've been owned by someone for a long time, and they're not developers, they don't have the wherewithal to understand how to take on a big project like that, or even have the money. And so these are the places that are most threatened in terms of when there's a mandate, that they'll be the ones where the owners will, it'll be much easier for them to sell or to demolish. It's pretty easy to get a demolition permit in the city. And I keep saying it's easier to tear down a building in the city than to remove a street tree. So, and I speak for, and that's just not right. And to have, and also there's the reality in the city with the development pressure that's been going on for decades now. It seems like there's sort of the quote unquote natural occurrence of these demolitions. So maybe these buildings might get demolished anyway for other purposes other than a mandate or an earthquake or something. But that's a whole other issue, a whole other session that's not related to URM. But and so there's a lot of, so those are the buildings that I worry about most. And they're not going to get landmark protection. You know, they might go through the process, but then they'll get denied because supposedly they don't meet any of the criteria, but they are still important places for a community. And that's the whole point of it, not whether it's a landmark or not, big L versus little L. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, if we had more time on the panel, we could problematize unintended, right? Because I've been reading Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and he says that, any policy that disproportionately impacts a racial group is a racist policy. However you cut it, it's a racist policy. So if a policy, if it's impacting a poor, low-income group, so again, it's not a fit policy. So I'm glad that we're talking about it, because it's clear that were this policy to be implemented, it might have several unintended consequences, and we need to be thinking about how to control those before the policy is in place, and not be reactive to that. So that brings me to our next question, which is, how do you see controlling for some or mitigating some of these negative impacts that might have a ripple effect in different neighborhoods, your neighborhood that you work in? Do you see, in your mind, is there a more inclusive policy? Do you know of precedents from around the world, where that could inform us in the way this policy might unfold? So just your thoughts on that. So we'll start with Karen this time and go anti-clockwise on my screen. Karen, Michael, and then Eugenia. So.
Okay, well, I actually feel like I can't add very much to this, because I don't know what those answers are, and I can't wait to hear some solutions, because these are, even though URM, any ordinance might not be happening for a while, and yet these are issues that are happening right now. Right now, businesses are being displaced as property owners are starting to think about this in the future. And I don't know. I guess anything that helps with the displacement piece, that's what I want help with.
I would say timing for planning, because if you look at it at the building by building stage, that could get complicated. But if you could look a little bit above that, and is there some sort of creative, wacky way where you do the buildings in phases and you could relocate the businesses around there, and then just kind of have SDCI just kind of take a pause on making sure that all the codes at every space are updated? Like when a business moves out of one space and they move into another, that causes a whole chain reaction of other things, right? Can you just kind of like say, we're just going to pause this because it's a temporary thing, but really thinking about it at more of a neighborhood scale, so you could try to work on some of this. I think putting money towards disaster relief, we should probably look at it as disaster prevention, which probably involves the federal government, right? Because we don't want to get at the point where we're having to fix it. We just want to fix it before everything happens. And I think it is really some of the education work, especially that Eugenia mentioned, is really, really important, because that way you're giving property owners options, so then they can make an informed decision other than feeling that pressure, and providing resources for them, whether it's help with the options or help with the financing or actually paying for it. We have this weird constitutional thing where, private property owners are all the same, regardless of whether it's the Mars, Barrymar across the street, or I don't know, Vulcan down the street the other way. They're treated the same, and it's a public safety issue, but there's also such benefit by having these historic buildings, that there's a public good, and we need to figure out, I don't know, how to tweak the Constitution or how to look at it in a different way so we can provide resources to them. And just, I think making displacement a stated goal of any of these policies is really, really important. I understand the life safety stuff, right? But it's not this is not a stated goal. So if you do that and think about it from that perspective, how do things change? And I think that's part of our jobs, is to kind of say, no, you're forgetting this. I understand that may not be the goal for all of you, but that's a goal for me. And I'm not going to go away and shut up until you at least acknowledge the fact that I'm saying that.
Yeah, I mean, everything you said is right on, and I think so. I just want to be clear that Historic Seattle supports a mandate. It's important. It's public
As do we.
safety. So I just want to be clear. That doesn't mean we can't be critical of what that mandate might be, because we need to look at it with a critical eye. I think because it happens before the URM policy committee, there was an earlier technical committee. So many years ago. and I think because it's both started so long ago, the city has taken a different approach now, and they do put a race and social justice lens on everything they do, and that is the piece that seems to be missing here. So and so I think a more interdepartmental approach, so it's not just falls on SDCI, it's not just a technical thing, but you know, with planning and neighborhoods and housing and all the departments that sort of where it should, you know, mean something to this, why this is important, because the various departments, they have connections throughout the various communities in different ways, and with organizations like the Alliance, Pioneer Square, and SCIPTA, and our organization, and many others in different neighborhoods. And so a more inclusive approach that's more integrated. And so that you're working together rather than, oh, this is this department, this is their goal, and they don't speak to some other department. And if you think about it, there are a finite number of these URM buildings. We're not building new URM buildings, so it's not like, you know, we should know the universe. We generally do know what they are and in which neighborhoods they are, and that's all mapped on GIS. So there should not be many surprises there, and so you can really kind of take a focused approach, and most of them are in the Pioneer Square and CID, and you look along arterials in certain ones, and so you can see a pattern here. And then just sort of have a more targeted kind of team approach, and just really attack it. And then easier said than done, obviously. And then, you know, obviously, instead of just sort of going, well, where's the money coming from? I don't know, you know. It can be frustrating, but this mandate is necessary, and it shouldn't be political, but it becomes political. And why a draft is there draft legislation that exists? Is it pretty much done? It just needs to go to city council, or I mean, I you know, it's unclear to me. And so, and why hasn't it been taken further? We know why. It's easy to come up with excuses, and particularly this year. Not that COVID. I mean, obviously COVID is important and it affects everyone. But I agree with what Michael said earlier. My concern is it's probably not going to come back for a while.
Thank you. So I'm hearing all of you mention somehow, you know, magically controlling for displacement in a really hot real estate market like Seattle. So I heard that. I want to push this further on. Do you have any sense of some tools or incentives that might work better in your neighborhoods? And all of you don't have to respond to this. Some tools or incentives that might work better for your neighborhoods or for the city that might be able to control displacement to some degree. So that's one thing that I want to know. And then the other thing that I'd like to know from you is that with this policy, should it go through the race and social justice initiative and the toolkit? I know the toolkit is pretty basic. Has it gone through that? Do you know about it, whether or not it's intended to be vetted by that initiative? So anyone can go first.
I was gonna say, Manish, there was a presentation, you know, time for me, just, I can't remember time. I mean, I think it was 2 years ago, maybe. The head of emergency management at the City of Seattle gave a presentation, and she was very clear at the point that because of where earthquakes would really impact city, that it's people of color that would be most impacted, but the policies would also thus impact people of color the most. I think, so I think there is that understanding and knowledge at the city. The city knows about Portland and the lawsuit that the NAACP did on posting signs up about, I think it was the NAACP in Portland, that because Portland made this thing where people had to stick signs on URM buildings warning people and what are the, I think they're aware of it, but I feel like at a certain point, it is so expensive and it's just better to bury your head. That's where my pessimism comes, right, from all of this. So I do think that people are aware, but people are feeling so limited in their tools that, and we've got all kinds of other issues going on, whether it's COVID or whether it's our bridges or it's other infrastructure, right? So how do you make sure that historic properties in our communities are considered part of that infrastructure? We don't call, it's really funny what the city calls infrastructure sometimes. They don't think electricity is infrastructure. They don't think internet is infrastructure. And obviously it is at this point. Water mains and sewers, not quite infrastructure. I mean, we live in an older city where we need to invest in this sort of stuff. And I do think we are kind of stuck in this belief, as well as other weird concepts of what being in America means.
Yeah, I know the thing about tools and incentives, I know for this, for the URM, that's been definitely researched and studied and evaluated a lot. And if there are new ones, they get kind of added to the chart or the list. But unfortunately, the answer is there's no free money anywhere. A city's not going to give private property owners money to fix up their buildings.
Probably can't, right?
Yeah, they probably can't. But that shouldn't just stop us and end there. I mean, it's sort of, if we know the policy, if we know the mandate is the right thing to do, inertia isn't going to get us anywhere. We're never going to have a perfect policy or perfect legislation or perfect tools and incentive. That's never going to happen. It doesn't happen in any other topic or whatever else that we do that's important in our lives.
Nothing's perfect.
Nothing. So, just rip the Band-Aid off, pass the thing, and let's just let's work together and figure it out. And that's sort of the very blunt sort of response.
Well, and I guess I would hope that the city does dig in a little bit to try to figure out some incentives to deal with the displacement issue. And I would love to see them creative to find ways to keep businesses in neighborhoods in the future. So I don't know what those incentives are, but I would love for it to work out so John can move out of our building, but I can call Maiko and Maiko can figure out how to put him up temporarily or something, but it feels like that's something.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. I believe as the programs and incentives, our tools and incentives are developed as part of the policy, once it's through the bureaucratic channels, there are going to be some financial tools available to populations or building owners who are impacted by the policy. So we can hope for the best, but as all of you mentioned, that we don't live in a perfect world, and Eugenia, I understand no policy is perfect. It's going to continue to impact populations, but I think the city's heart is in the right place with this policy, in that they want buildings and people to be safe, but just the heart being in the right place is not enough. It's simply not enough, because you can just say I meant well, but so that's not enough. So we'd set aside. Thank you very much, all the panelists. We'd set aside some time for questions. So I'm going to take a question and throw it out. And whoever wants to respond, you can respond. Let me see if I can pull up the question. So we have a question about insurance. The question is, how is the URM mandate affecting the insurance industry? I really know nothing about it. So I'm hoping to hear from you, your thoughts.
Can I
Yeah,
go?
go ahead. Anyone? Yeah.
Outside of URM, our insurance at the SCID PDA is kind of going nuts. I think it's partly because of climate change, because of all the wildfires down in California, all that. So our property insurance is kind of going a little crazy and being labeled an anarchist jurisdiction in a high crime area, which the Chinatown International District is. Our insurance is going up 25% this past year, 25% next year. We have a property owner who was forced to get a certain level of earthquake insurance. When they got earthquake insurance, there were 2 insurance carriers that they could work with. 2 weeks after they signed up, the earthquake happened in California, no insurance carriers. The insurance is costing them, I think, $170,000 a year just for earthquake, and they had not anticipated it being anywhere near that dollar amount. So much as I think there probably needs to be some sort of intervention on earthquake insurance, whether it's, I guess the federal government does like flood insurance, floodplain insurance, they have to somehow guarantee that, because if we all go out and start doing URM retrofits, our neighborhood won't be able to have enough banks if we choose to work with them, because we won't all be able to get earthquake insurance. And the adjusters are going to be like, ooh, I have too much risk in this neighborhood because all these buildings are URM. I won't be able to do that, right? And so then that becomes an impediment for getting your work done. Maybe it's only my insurance. Maybe it's just the PDA's insurance, right? That's just gone crazy. But yeah.
Anyone else wants to add to that?
That is not an area of my knowledge for me. Sorry. Someone else in the office takes care of the insurance.
And even before this, even as an affordable housing developer and provider of affordable housing, I really couldn't afford earthquake insurance because it was so expensive.
So following up on that, so there's definitely cost burdens on populations, and as you say that they may have to make the difficult decision of selling their buildings or getting a demo permit or selling it to a developer, or in case of in the Chinatown ID where there are multiple owners, I don't know how, Michael, that would impact the building's future. If so there are many things to be thinking about as we move forward with this. Is there any and this is the probably the last question. How do you want to want the city to address some of this before the policy takes into effect? Are there channels that you're looking for? You have especially Michael and Karen, you have the ear of the city. Are they hearing you when you're talking about it? What is the response you're getting? I want to hear some of that. Your thoughts on that.
I go to Karen. Go, Karen.
Oh wow, yeah. I mean, they say they understand, but I have not heard that the city has any idea of tools they can offer or resources or, yeah. I know they want to listen. I know they mean well, but I don't know any specifics that I can point to.
Okay.
I don't have the ear of the city, even though I am a city chartered entity. I mean, for the most part, they kind of look at me as a burden or like that. I think within certain departments, just because of relationships with certain departments, they understand. The city has done some investment over time outside of all of the hours that Manish and Eugenia spent on that damn committee that started 4 or 5 mayors ago, right? Talking about financing tools, but we run into certain limitations always, and there's always challenges, and it is that multidisciplinary approach I think that Eugenia is talking about. I think those decisions have to be at a higher enough level, and the impacts of this and the decision making for this and the work plan for this goes across multiple mayoral administrations, right? Because you want enough time for this. And things change under different administrations. And what was the joy of one administration is totally unsexy and unwanted in another. So you're dealing with this and you need some stability. We're not necessarily getting that at the governmental level, but also the world level doesn't quite deal with it. And, you know, earthquakes are kind of unpredictable. So you just don't know when it's going to show up.
Yeah, thank you. We have a couple more questions. Sorry to interrupt, Eugenia. Sorry. I think one, Nick will answer one, and I can't see Nick. I cannot see the two other questions. You want to ask that because my question panel is not showing that question.
Oh, sure. I think this is a good one to end on too, because I think it's kind of a catalyst for what's happening next. And the question is, are the people raising their voices, and maybe they need more awareness, or maybe a massive outreach that people would mobilize them to give them a loud shout out to the city, or any place where these issues are happening and cropping up.
Eugenia, I'm gonna put you on the spot.
Well, the essence of the question is, are people raising their voices, and really to bring these issues to the forefront of the discussions.
Raising their voices in support of. There's a lot of people raising their voices against the mandate, so I'm. Is that the question?
Yeah, I think
it's more pertaining to the raising their awareness about the issues that you all have discussed today, and bringing attention and light on those unintended consequences that we need to address at the forefront.
I think all three of us, and probably Manish as well, we've raised these various issues in certain forms to the city or in public meetings, and we've done that, not in a very specific, let's attack these concerns and issues specifically. It's part of a discussion, but yeah, I think it's a good question, because the whole raising awareness thing always gets the attention of the city, especially the decision makers. And generally, if for an issue, if enough people say something or raise a stink, they'll listen. And it's really important, I think, to really bring up the equity and inclusion thing. And as Michael talked about earlier, sort of, we know, and the city knows, that the impact will be in areas where there's more people of color, there's more represented communities, that is going to be disproportionate. And so I think they probably just need to hear, yeah, it's a good point. You hear from they've been hearing from property owners mainly. This is generally in terms of raising awareness, it hasn't gone much beyond people directly impacted, other than if you own a building, or maybe you might, and it hasn't gone a whole lot beyond that, other than our organizations as well, some of the community groups that try to help people. But it's not an easy one to get people's heads wrapped around. It's not the greatest.
Well, I do wonder sometimes if a more pointed community outreach plan, I think about the waterfront has a real specific community outreach plan where they're meeting, going block by block, meeting with property owners and businesses. And I do wonder if a specific plan might be helpful.
I worry about that only because who's delivering the message? Are you ever going to get to the property owner?
Yeah.
And in my neighborhood, it's oh, well, Sound Transit just came by last week, and this other government came by last week, and another one. And in our neighborhood, sometimes we have scams, right? We had somebody selling COVID insurance. There's no such thing as COVID insurance. When Trump got Trump was named president, somebody was going around selling immigration insurance, right? And people would do this. So I think there's a real fear of government in general within some of our communities. And when you start getting into these issues that are multi-million, that are dealing with your property, with your asset, something that you were told never to get rid of, never to sell, and then you want other people in your business of trying to figure all this out, it gets complicated. And so I do think, though, it is the work of like Historic Seattle going out and working with property owners, or ourselves working with property owners, and just trying to give them advice and support, but not being necessarily funded directly by the property owner to do it, because then it looks like we're like doing a money scam. It's the appearances of that, right? And so I do think it gets complicated.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I think we needed more time to hammer out these points. Of course, we have all the solutions, but thank you, panelists. In the interest of time, we have to wrap it up. There's some other questions which Nick and I will figure out how to respond to those outside of the panel. But we're out of time, and thanks again. And I'll follow up with all of you, because I will be moving forward with another publication on it. So yeah, that's how I bring about awareness.
Great.
So thank you.
Thank you. And if there's an earthquake, go under your desk.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
That's
Bye-bye.
my tip.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nick, do you want to wrap up? How does this thing close?
Oh, I just hit end webinar and then it closes it down. So I will end by just saying thank you all for coming and engaging. This is certainly not the end of the discussion. The discussion will continue forward, and we will continue to be coordinated in our voice to raise these types of issues, because they're just as important as the technical standards. And that's why I felt like it was so important to have all of you sharing your perspectives from all the work that you do. So thank you all for joining us, and I'll see you again some other time.
Yep.
Cool.
Be careful.
Right. Thanks.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.